"You're going west in her place," her father said, and slid the train ticket across the table, like it was nothing, like she was nothing. Maggie Collins stared at that ticket and felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Her sister had run off with a merchant's son, and now Maggie Plain, practical forgotten. Maggie was supposed to board a train to Colorado and marry a stranger who had never once written her name. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow every part until the end. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The ticket had been purchased 3 months ago for Charlotte. It was stamped with a departure date, a destination, and the kind of quiet promise that only a train ticket could carry. The promise that somewhere at the end of the line, a life was waiting. A real life. A house. A name. A man who had saved enough years of loneliness to finally ask a woman to share them with him. Charlotte Collins had held that ticket against her chest and called it destiny. Then she handed it back to their father and married Daniel Pryor, the merchant's son from Millfield, without telling anyone until it was already done. That was 3 weeks ago. Now Maggie sat at the kitchen table and stared at the same ticket, and the only thing she could think was that her name wasn't on it anywhere. "It's already arranged," her father said. He stood near the window with his arms crossed the way he always stood when a decision had already been made and he was only informing the room. "Samuel Reed is expecting a bride. The arrangements were made in good faith. We gave our word." "Charlotte gave her word," Maggie said quietly. "Charlotte is married to Daniel Pryor now." He said it the way he said everything about Charlotte, with a patience he never quite managed for Maggie. "What's done is done. And what about what's right?" Her father looked at her then, really looked at her. And what Maggie saw in his face wasn't cruelty exactly, but something almost worse. The calm certainty of a man who had already organized the world into useful things and less useful things, and had placed his daughters accordingly. "You're 25 years old," he said. "You've worked this farm for 10 years. You know how to run a household, keep animals, manage a kitchen, survive a hard winter. Samuel Reed needs a woman who can manage a working ranch." He paused. "You're more suited for that kind of life anyway." Maggie didn't answer right away. She looked down at the table, at her hands, at the calluses along her palms from years of field work, at the small scar on her left thumb from a fence wire when she was 19. Hands that had never been praised. Hands that had never been held by anyone who wasn't handing her another task. "You're more suited for that kind of life anyway." She understood exactly what he meant. He meant Charlotte is beautiful and delicate and deserves softness. You are not those things. You are strong and you are capable, and those are fine qualities, but they are working qualities. Qualities a man values in a mule or a good pair of boots, not in a woman he chooses. What he said out loud was a compliment. What she heard was the truth she had lived with all her life. "I'll go," she said. Her father nodded and looked relieved, which was its own kind of answer. "But I won't lie to him." Her father's expression shifted. "Maggie, I won't go there and pretend to be Charlotte." Her voice was steady. She had made this decision in the space of a single breath, and she already knew she wouldn't unmake it. "If I go as myself, and I tell him the truth the moment I arrive. He can put me on the next train back if he wants to, but I won't begin a marriage with a deception. You'll ruin everything." Then it was already ruined. She packed 2 bags. She had no photograph to send ahead of herself, which she supposed was appropriate. Charlotte had sent a beautiful one soft, light, careful pose, the kind of picture that made a woman look like the answer to a prayer. Maggie had never once sat for a photograph in her life. She packed her work clothes, 2 dresses for Sunday, her mother's Bible, and a small tin of her mother's recipes. Not because she thought she'd need them, but because they were the only things she owned that felt like something worth carrying. The night before she left, she sat on the edge of her bed for a long time and thought about Samuel Reed. She knew him only through the letters Charlotte had shared, and even those she had read secondhand, Charlotte reading them aloud. Sometimes laughing softly at the serious tone, the careful handwriting, the way he measured every sentence like a man who wasn't used to expressing himself and wanted to get it exactly right. He had written about the ranch, about the mountains in the distance that turned pink at sunset, about how quiet it got in the evenings, a quiet he had stopped minding, but sometimes wished he could share. He had written about what he wanted, not wealth, not beauty, not a woman to impress the county, but a partner. Someone who understood that life on the frontier was difficult and chose it anyway. He had sounded, Maggie thought, like a lonely man trying very hard to be honest. She understood that feeling better than Charlotte ever had. She blew out the lamp, and in the dark, she made herself one promise. Whatever happened at the other end of that train journey, she would not be a coward. She would not apologize for existing. She would tell the truth, stand straight, and accept whatever came next. She owed Samuel Reed that much. She owed herself more. The train journey took 4 days. Maggie sat near the window and watched the country change around her, the flat farmland she had known all her life, giving way to something wider and wilder. The sky expanding until it felt like too much sky, like more sky than a person was meant to see. She had never traveled beyond the county line before. She had never been anywhere. She was not afraid exactly. She was something harder to name, a feeling, like standing at the edge of a very high place, not knowing whether the wind would lift you or drop you, but knowing the jump had already been made. She talked to a woman named Edna, who was traveling to Denver to visit her daughter. Edna was 70 years old and had crossed this country twice, and had opinions about everything, which Maggie found oddly comforting. She talked to a young ranch hand who was heading home after a season working cattle drives and who looked so tired he could barely keep his eyes open. She did not talk to anyone about where she was going or why. On the third night, she took out the last letter Charlotte had received from Samuel Reed and read it again. She had no right to it technically, but Charlotte had left it behind without a second thought, the way she left behind most things that had served their purpose. "I think about what it would mean to have someone to come home to," he had written. "Not someone to impress or perform for. Just someone who is there. Someone who knows the sound of the ranch at night and doesn't find it frightening. Someone who understands that this life asks a great deal and gives a great deal in return and finds that a fair bargain. I suppose what I am saying is that I am not looking for a storybook. I am looking for something real." Maggie folded the letter carefully and put it in her coat pocket. She thought, whoever you are, Samuel Reed, at least you're honest about what you want. She thought, I hope you meant it. She arrived at Calder Station on a Thursday afternoon in late May. The platform was not what she expected. Smaller, dustier, more makeshift than the train stations back east, with a wooden overhang that cast a stripe of shade across the planks, and a general store visible down the dirt road that seemed to double as the social center of whatever town this was. She stepped off the train with her 2 bags and stood still for a moment while the other passengers moved around her, and she looked for the man from the letters. She found him before he found her. He was standing at the far end of the platform with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, the way a person does when they're working at being patient. He was taller than she expected, broader, with the kind of build that spoke less of vanity than of years of physical work. His face was weathered and serious, with the lines around his eyes that come from squinting into too much sun. He looked like someone who had learned long ago that the world didn't arrange itself to be comfortable and had simply decided to proceed anyway. He was looking past her, looking for Charlotte. Maggie stood still and let him look. She watched the moment he realized the woman he was looking for wasn't coming. She saw it happen across his face, the scanning, the slight confusion, the stillness that followed. And then he looked at her, and she walked toward him before she could talk herself out of it. "Mr. Reed," she said. "Yes." His voice was careful. "Are you—" "I'm Maggie Collins. Charlotte Collins is my sister." She kept her voice level. She had rehearsed this on the train for 4 days, and she found that it was easier than she expected, because the truth usually was, it was only the waiting to tell it that was hard. She changed her mind about the arrangement. She married someone else 3 weeks ago. My father decided I should come in her place. Samuel Reed said nothing. He looked at her with those quiet, steady eyes, and said nothing for long enough that Maggie felt the silence begin to take weight. "I want you to know," she continued, "that I did not agree with this plan. Not because I wouldn't be willing to work hard or make a genuine life here, But because you wrote to my sister for 6 months, and you deserve to know exactly who is standing in front of you." She held his gaze. "I'm not her. I don't look like her photograph. I wasn't the woman you chose. And I think you have every right to put me on the next train back east, and I won't hold it against you." Samuel turned his hat, one more slow rotation in his hands. "What's your name again?" he asked. "Margaret. Maggie." "How long have you known about this plan, Maggie?" "3 weeks. And you came anyway." "I came to tell you the truth. I couldn't let you spend another 3 weeks waiting for a woman who wasn't coming without at least having the decency to say so in person." Something moved behind his eyes. She couldn't have said what it was. "When's the next train east?" he asked. Her heart went tight. "Tomorrow morning, I believe. I checked before I left." He nodded slowly. "Then you'll stay tonight," he said. "And tomorrow, you can make whatever decision you'd like." He reached down and picked up her heavier bag before she could protest, and turned and walked toward a wagon at the edge of the road, and after a moment, Maggie picked up her remaining bag and followed him. The ride to Reed Ranch took 40 minutes. They did not speak much. Maggie had spent 4 days preparing to tell the truth, and now that she had told it, she found she didn't have an organized speech for whatever came next. Samuel drove with his eyes on the road, and his jaw set in that particular way. A man's jaw sets when he is thinking hard about something and hasn't reached a conclusion yet. The land opened up around them as they traveled wide and rolling with the mountains rising in the distance, like something that had been painted there as a backdrop, and then turned out to be real. The grass moved in long, slow waves. The sky above them was the kind of blue that didn't exist back home, or hadn't seemed to. Maggie looked at all of it and thought no wonder Charlotte didn't want to come here. And then with some surprise, no wonder he loves it. "Were you close?" Samuel asked finally. She glanced at him. "I'm sorry. You and your sister, were you close?" Maggie considered this honestly. "We loved each other in the way sisters do when they've grown up in the same house. But no, I don't think we were close in the way you mean." She paused. "Charlotte is beautiful and lively, and every room she walks into feels different. People notice her immediately. I think I spent most of my life noticing her too. And she never noticed you. She noticed me when she needed something." She said it without bitterness, just as a fact. "Charlotte isn't cruel. She lives in the world she's most comfortable in. Other people's feelings don't always register as quite real to her." Samuel made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite dismissal. "The letters she sent you," Maggie said. "Did they sound like someone who actually wanted this life?" A pause. "I thought so at the time. She's a wonderful writer," Maggie said honestly. "She always knew exactly what to say to make something sound the way it ought to sound. She used to write her beaux' love letters for them when she was 16. Said they were too clumsy to do it themselves." She felt him look at her. "She wrote better than she meant is what I'm telling you," Maggie said. "I'm not saying she was dishonest exactly. I think she half believed it when she wrote it. But Charlotte has always been better at the idea of things than the reality of them." He was quiet for a long moment. "Why did you come?" he asked. "Really, you could have written a letter." "I thought about that." She looked at her hands in her lap. "I thought about it for 2 weeks. And then I thought about you reading a letter standing at that station, waiting for a woman who wasn't coming, and I couldn't do it. You wrote to her honestly. You deserved better than a letter." The wagon rolled on. "Also," Maggie said and stopped. "Also." She looked at the mountains. "My father said I was more suited for this kind of life anyway, and he wasn't wrong about the work. But I thought if I was going to find out, I'd rather find out for myself than have someone else decide for me." Reed Ranch was larger than she expected. She had imagined a small homestead, maybe a house and a barn, and some fencing. What she found was something closer to a working operation, a main house built solid and square, a long bunkhouse, several outbuildings, a barn with real timber framing fencing that stretched further than she could see, and a crew of ranch hands who were wrapping up the evening's work as the wagon rolled in. The men stopped what they were doing to look. She felt their eyes on her, not unkindly. mostly just with the frank curiosity of people who had been told a woman was arriving and were now assessing the reality against whatever they had imagined. One of them, older with a gray beard and a permanent squint, came toward the wagon. "Boss," he said. Then he looked at Maggie. This is Miss Collins," Samuel said in a tone that closed the question without quite answering it. "She'll be staying in the house tonight. Tell Mrs. Henley." The older man, she would learn later that his name was Cal, short for Calvin, and that he had worked the ranch for 11 years and considered himself something between a foreman and Samuel's conscience, nodded without further comment and walked back toward the bunkhouse. Maggie climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. Samuel carried her heavy bag to the door of the house and set it down. "Dinner's at 6, he said. "You're welcome to it." "Thank you." He nodded and walked away. Maggie picked up her bag and stood at the threshold of the house. She thought tomorrow morning there is a train going east. She thought I could be on it. She thought I came all this way to tell a man the truth, and he heard it, and he didn't send me away tonight. She stepped inside. Mrs. Henley was the cook, a stout, energetic woman in her 50s who had apparently been running the kitchen at Reed Ranch since before Samuel inherited it from his father, and who had very particular opinions about everything which she expressed without being asked and with complete confidence. She took one look at Maggie and said, "You're not the one from the photograph." "No," Maggie agreed. "Good," Mrs. Henley said, and turned back to her stove. That photograph looked like a woman who's never set foot in a real kitchen. Maggie blinked. "Sit down," Mrs. Henley said, gesturing at the kitchen table. "You look like you've been on a train for 4 days." "I have been on a train for 4 days." "Then sit down, and I'll get you something to eat before dinner." She poured a cup of coffee and set it in front of Maggie without ceremony. "You eaten today?" "Not since this morning." Mrs. Henley set a plate of biscuits on the table. "Eat. We can talk after." Maggie ate. She was hungrier than she'd realized, and the biscuits were better than anything she'd eaten since leaving home, and she sat in that kitchen for a few minutes, feeling for the first time in weeks something close to settled. "What did he say?" Mrs. Henley asked eventually, her back still to Maggie. "When you told him?" "That I could stay tonight and make my own decision in the morning." Mrs. Henley stirred something on the stove. "That sounds like him." Did he seem—" "He doesn't show much," Mrs. Henley said. "Never has. His mother used to say he came out of the womb already thinking things through. But he's fair. If he's angry, he'll say so eventually." She glanced over her shoulder. "He's not angry." "How do you know?" "Because he carried your bag to the door instead of leaving it in the wagon." Dinner was at a long table in the main house. Maggie had expected to eat separately or to be left out entirely. But Samuel said nothing to exclude her and nothing to include her in any formal way. He simply set a place at the table and expected her to fill it, which she supposed was its own kind of statement. There were 6 ranch hands at dinner, plus Cal and Mrs. Henley. 8 people, including Samuel and Maggie. The conversation was about cattle movements and a fence section that needed repair, and something complicated involving a water source that 2 of the hands argued about with great enthusiasm until Cal told them both to be quiet. Nobody asked Maggie anything directly, but she noticed they watched her measured glances, the kind that aren't hostile but aren't certain yet either. The kind that are waiting to see who you are before deciding how to treat you. After dinner, when the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Henley had cleaned up and retired to her room, Maggie was washing her coffee cup at the basin when Samuel came back inside. He stood in the kitchen doorway. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She finished washing the cup and set it on the shelf. "What time is it?" "About 8. She dried her hands. "Mr. Reed, may I ask you something?" He leaned against the doorframe. "Go ahead." "The letter. The last one Charlotte received. She left it behind." Maggie reached into her coat pocket and brought it out. "I read it on the train. I shouldn't have, but I did." She held it out to him. "I want to give it back to you." He looked at the letter. He didn't take it immediately. "Why?" he asked. "Because she gave up the right to it. And it was written honestly. It should go back to the person who wrote it. He crossed the kitchen and took the letter from her hand. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket without looking at it again. "You read it," he said. "What did you think?" Maggie considered her words carefully. "I thought you were the kind of man who meant what he wrote. And I thought it was a shame that Charlotte was too much like the person she sent the photograph of to understand what she was reading." A pause. "That's a complicated compliment," Samuel said. "I give complicated compliments sometimes." She met his eyes. "I give simple ones too." That was the truth either way. He held her gaze for a moment longer than she expected. Then he said, "Good night, Miss Collins." "Good night, Mr. Reed." He turned and walked out of the kitchen. And Maggie stood alone in the quiet of that house and listened to the sound of the ranch at night. The horses settling in the barn, the wind moving against the walls, the enormous silence of all that open land surrounding everything. And she thought, he wrote that he was looking for someone who knows the sound of the ranch at night and doesn't find it frightening. She didn't find it frightening. She found it unexpectedly and without any preparation, like something she recognized. She did not sleep well. She lay in the small spare room and stared at the ceiling and turned the situation over in her mind like a stone. You keep picking up to look at the underside of. The reasonable thing was to take the morning train. She had done what she came to do. She had told him the truth. He was not deceived. Her conscience was clear. The reasonable thing was to go home to the farm and explain to her father that the arrangement had not worked out and find some other arrangement for her future and put Colorado and Samuel Reed behind her as a strange and complete episode in her otherwise predictable life. She turned over. The reasonable thing. But Maggie had noticed washing dishes in that kitchen that the house was the kind of clean that comes from effort without love. Every surface functional, nothing unnecessary. Nothing that was there simply because it made a person feel good to look at it. She had noticed that Mrs. Henley cooked well, but cooked to feed people, not to comfort them. She had noticed that the men at dinner were respectful and hard-working, but ate in the silence of people who had never been given a reason to be otherwise. She had noticed that Samuel Reed ran this ranch with everything he had, and that everything he had was practical and disciplined and sufficient and lonely as a stone at the bottom of a river. She turned over again. She thought about what her father said. "You're more suited for that kind of life anyway." Maybe. Maybe that was true. But she wanted it to be her choice, not his. Not because Charlotte left. Hers. She made up her mind somewhere around 2 in the morning, lying still in the dark of a room that smelled like cedar and old wood, listening to the sound of a ranch that didn't know yet what it was missing. She would not take the morning train. She would ask to stay. Not as Charlotte's replacement, as herself. And if Samuel Reed said no, she would accept it. But she would ask. She was in the kitchen at 5 in the morning when he came in. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her at the stove. "Coffee's ready," she said without turning around. "I also started biscuits. Mrs. Henley's recipe is on the shelf. I hope that wasn't presumptuous." Silence. "Miss Collins, I want to stay." She turned from the stove and faced him. Not as Charlotte's replacement. Not as part of the original arrangement. Those terms don't apply anymore, and we both know it. She kept her voice level. "I want to stay as a woman who came here with nothing except honesty and wants to see if that's enough to build something real. You can pay me wages if that makes it more reasonable. Or I can work toward earning my keep until we both know whether this makes sense. But I don't want to get on that train this morning." Samuel Reed stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her for a long time. "Why?" he asked. "Because you wrote that you wanted something real. And I think I might be real enough." She paused. "And because when I listened to this ranch last night, I didn't want to leave." A long silence stretched between them. "You'd be working," he said at last. "Hard work, every day. I know how to work hard. You don't know this land. I can learn. People will ask questions. I can answer them honestly." He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he said, "The biscuits are going to burn." Maggie spun around and pulled the pan from the oven just in time. Behind her, she heard the sound of Samuel Reed sitting down at the kitchen table. And then quietly, so quietly she almost missed it. "Coffee first," he said. "Then we'll talk about what staying actually means." She poured him a cup. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. But she set the cup in front of him and sat down across the table, and outside the window, the mountains were beginning to turn pink in the early light, and somewhere below, all the fear and all the uncertainty and all the reasonable arguments for leaving something small and determined was holding very still, waiting to find out if it was allowed to take root. Samuel Reed was not a man who explained himself. Maggie learned that in the first week. He didn't announce his decisions. He didn't justify his schedule. He didn't tell people what he was thinking while he was thinking it. He moved through the day with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been working the same land for so long that most of it had stopped requiring words. It just required showing up, doing the thing, and moving to the next thing. But he watched. Maggie noticed that. He noticed everything. She had expected the first morning to be awkward, the two of them sitting across that kitchen table with a cup of coffee between them, and no clear agreement about what her staying actually meant. Instead, Samuel had drunk his coffee, eaten 2 biscuits without commenting on them, and then pushed back his chair and said, "Cal will show you the supply system this morning. Mrs. Henley will show you the kitchen stores. Afternoon, you can tell me what you think needs doing." That was it. No ceremony. No terms. No formal discussion of what she was or wasn't. Just here is the work. Show me who you are. Maggie understood that language better than most people would have. The supply system at Reed Ranch was a mess, not a disastrous mess. Not the kind of mess that meant things were falling apart, but the kind of slow, accumulated disorder that happens when a working operation has been run entirely by people who know where everything is and have never once needed to explain it to anyone else. Cal kept tallies in 3 different ledgers with 3 different systems. Mrs. Henley tracked the kitchen stores in her head and on scraps of paper stuck to the underside of the pantry shelf with pine tar. The feed and grain were accounted for out in the barn by a hand named Pete, who had his own system involving chalk marks on a wooden beam. Maggie spent the first morning just listening and watching and asking careful questions that she already knew the answers to, because the answers told her more about the people than about the supplies. "What happens when Cal's sick?" she asked Pete. Pete thought about it. "Don't rightly know. He's never been sick." "What happens if you need to order supplies while Mrs. Henley's away?" "She's never away," Pete said, and looked mildly troubled by the concept. "What if Samuel needs to know in January exactly how much grain he used in October?" Pete scratched the back of his neck. "He'd have to ask me, I reckon." Maggie nodded and wrote something in the small notebook she'd brought from home. By noon, she had enough to say what she thought needed doing. She found Samuel at the fence line behind the main barn. He was working with 2 of the hands on a section that had gone loose, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had fixed enough fence in his life that his hands knew what to do without consulting the rest of him. He saw her coming and said something to the men beside him, and they kept working while he walked toward her. "Well," he said, "you have 3 separate accounting systems that don't talk to each other," Maggie said. "Cal's ledgers, Mrs. Henley's pantry notes, and Pete's chalk marks. If you ever need to reconstruct what happened in any given month, you'd have to interview 3 people and hope their memories matched up." Samuel looked at her. "Also," she continued, "you're short on salt pork for the bunkhouse by my estimate of about 6 weeks' worth, and whoever ordered the last batch of flour ordered the wrong grade for biscuit making, which is why Mrs. Henley's been compensating with extra lard, and it's making the texture too dense." A pause. "She's been using too much lard. She's been compensating for substandard flour. There's a difference." Maggie held up her notebook. "I can build you one system. Everything in one place. Cal can still keep his tallies if he wants. It'll give me numbers to work from. But you should have a single record that any one person can read and understand." Samuel wiped his hands on a rag. "Can you do that?" he asked. "I already started." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly. More like the look of someone who has just noticed a tool in the shed they didn't know they had. "All right," he said. He turned and walked back to the fence. Maggie turned and walked back to the house. It was the longest conversation they'd had all day, and it had lasted about 90 seconds, and she had learned more about Samuel Reed from it than from 4 days of train travel studying his letters. He didn't waste words. Neither did she. Maybe her father had been right about one thing after all. The ranch hands decided about her over the following week. Not all at once, and not formally, but in the way communities always decide about outsiders, through a series of small interactions that accumulate into a verdict that everyone somehow knows without anyone having called a vote. The first thing they noticed was that she worked. Not that she worked hard. Hard work on a ranch was simply expected and not particularly remarkable, but that she worked without performing it. She didn't need anyone to see her doing it. She didn't announce what she'd accomplished or angle for acknowledgement. She just moved through the day getting things done with the same quiet practicality that the best ranch hands had the ones who had been doing it so long they'd stopped needing it to look like anything. The second thing they noticed was that she didn't complain. This was relevant because frontier ranch life had 1,000 small miseries. Daily, the cold before dawn, the aching back at noon, the dinner that was adequate rather than good, the endless weather, the smell, the mud in season, the dust out of season. Most people complained. It was almost a social function, the shared language of people living through difficulty together. Maggie didn't complain, but she also didn't perform stoicism. She just seemed to genuinely accept conditions as they were and work within them. The third thing. The thing that really turned the tide was the bunkhouse kitchen. It happened on a Thursday, 12 days after she arrived. Mrs. Henley had come down with a cold, nothing serious, but enough that she'd been told by Maggie to stay in her room and drink the broth Maggie was keeping warm on the stove. The crew's dinner fell to Maggie by default, and she spent the afternoon in the kitchen with Pete, helping her haul supplies, and a hand named Young Thomas, hovering near the doorway, under the impression that he was being subtle. She made a beef and potato stew that used up some of the salt pork before it could go bad. Cornbread, baked in cast iron, and a dried apple dessert, using her mother's recipe that she'd almost not made because it felt like the kind of thing that needed a reason. At 6 o'clock, she put it all on the table and rang the bell. The crew came in, they ate, and something happened that Maggie wouldn't fully understand until later, when Cal explained it to her with the gruff clarity of a man who had been around long enough to recognize the thing when he saw it. They talked. Not just the low necessary exchanges about work and weather and tomorrow's schedule, they actually talked. Young Thomas told a story about a horse he'd tried to break in his first year that had everyone at the table laughing, including the 2 older hands who usually said almost nothing at dinner. Pete argued with Cal about something involving a cattle drive from 3 years ago, and the argument got loud and cheerful and turned into a kind of collaborative memory building where both of them were adding details they'd forgotten they remembered. One of the other men asked Maggie a question about where she'd come from, and for the first time since she arrived, the conversation at the table included her as something more than a passing subject. Samuel came in near the end. He stood in the doorway for a moment before anyone noticed him. Maggie noticed, but she didn't show it, and what she saw on his face when he looked at that table full of men laughing and arguing and eating together was something she'd seen before on her mother's face once, a long time ago. Relief. Like a person who has been worried about something for so long they'd stopped consciously worrying about it, and have just this minute been told it's all right. He sat down at the head of the table, and Cal shoved the cornbread toward him without breaking his argument with Pete, and Samuel helped himself and ate and listened to the noise of it. And after a while, he looked down the table at Maggie with an expression she couldn't quite read. She looked back and then looked away and refilled young Thomas's coffee cup. Later, after the hands had gone and she was cleaning up, Samuel came into the kitchen. "What was in that dessert?" he said. "Dried apples, brown sugar, my mother's recipe." "My mother used to make something like that." He said it simply without apparent weight, but she heard the weight in it anyway. "Mine called it poor man's pie," Maggie said, "which meant we made it often." He made a small sound. "Mine called it Sunday pie, which meant the same thing." She folded the dish towel. "Mr. Reed," she said, Can I ask you something I've been wondering about? Depends what it is. What happened to your family? The letters he mentioned feeling a particular kind of quiet, like someone who'd been alone longer than they expected. She saw his jaw tighten slightly, not with anger, with the careful management of something old. My parents died in 77, he said. Fever, both of them within 2 weeks of each other. He looked at the table. My younger brother took the east part of the property and sold it. He wanted city work. The ranch came to me and I kept it going. A pause. I've been running it alone since. 7 years, Maggie said quietly. 7 years. She didn't say she was sorry. She had the instinct that he'd heard sorry many times and that it didn't do much anymore. Instead, she said, "You built something worth keeping." He looked at her. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I did." The supply ledger was finished by the end of the second week. Maggie had reorganized everything into a single bound record, monthly tallies cross-referenced against the kitchen stores and the feed barn, with a running column for each category that showed what they had, what they'd used, and what they needed to order before the next supply run. Cal had looked at it with the deep suspicion of a man confronting something that made his own system look inadequate, and then spent 20 minutes going through it page by page without saying anything, and then told Maggie it was reasonable, which she had already learned from Mrs. Henley was Cal's version of high praise. Samuel went through it in the evening. He sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of him and read through it the way he read everything systematically, without rushing tracking the logic of it, rather than just the numbers. Maggie sat across from him sorting seed packets for the kitchen garden she'd proposed, and that he'd approved with a single nod, which she took to mean yes. "You put the forecast column in," he said. "Yes." "Where'd you learn to do that?" "I kept our farm's accounts for 8 years. She tied a seed packet. "My father isn't good with numbers. He knows it, so he stopped looking at them, which meant someone had to. And that was you. That was me." He turned another page. "Estimated savings on the grain order if you shift to the Brennan supplier. 14% over the season." She tied another packet. "They're 6 miles further, but they carry the better grade, and if you're buying in bulk, it covers the difference in transport. Pete can confirm the road's usable year-round." Samuel closed the ledger. He set both hands flat on the cover and was quiet for a moment. "Maggie," he said. She looked up. "Why wasn't this being done before?" "Because there was no one here who wasn't already doing 3 other things." She said it without accusation. "You have a good crew. They know their work. But organization isn't the same thing as work. It's the thing that holds the work together." She paused. "You were carrying it all in your head." "I managed." "You managed excellently. That's not the point." She met his eyes. "The point is what happens to this ranch if something happens to you. Right now, without you here to hold it together, it would come apart in a season. With this system, Cal or Pete or whoever you trust could pick it up and keep it running." He looked at her. "You thought about that," he said. "I thought about it the first morning I looked at Cal's ledgers." "Why?" She considered the question honestly. "Because this place matters. You can tell it matters because of how carefully it's been kept. And things that matter should be protected against single points of failure." She paused. "That's not a romantic sentiment. That's just how you take care of something you value." The silence that followed was different from the silences they usually had. Those were the silences of 2 people being efficient with language. This one was the silence of something that had shifted quietly and without announcement, like ice in a river when the season begins to change. Samuel picked up the ledger again. "I'll review the Brennan numbers with Cal," he said. "Of course." He stood. "Good work, Maggie." She looked back down at her seed packets. "Thank you, Samuel." It was the first time she'd used his first name. Neither of them mentioned it. The town noticed her on the 3rd week. She had gone into Calder with Cal to handle the supply order which Samuel had delegated to her without ceremony, and which Cal had accepted without visible objection. Though she noticed he drove a little faster than usual on the way in, as if proximity to a potential complication was best minimized. Calder was small enough that a new woman on the Reed Ranch account was the kind of development that required no announcement. It simply became known, the way all things became known in small frontier towns, which was immediately and thoroughly. The woman at the general store counter was named Mrs. Patricia Wills, and she was friendly in the particular way of people who are collecting information while appearing to offer warmth. "And you are?" she asked when Cal introduced Maggie as the Reed Ranch housekeeper, a word they'd agreed on in the wagon, as it was the simplest and least interesting description they could find. "Margaret Collins," Maggie said. "Maggie." "Collins." Mrs. Wills tilted her head slightly. "Any relation to the young woman who was corresponding with Samuel Reed Charlotte Collins, I believe." "My sister," Maggie said evenly. "Charlotte changed her plans. I came instead." The store was not large. The two other women who happened to be shopping in it at that moment both found reasons to drift toward the counter area. "Changed her plans," Mrs. Wills repeated with the tone of someone cataloging a data point. "And you're working at the ranch." "I'm managing the household accounts and the supply system." Maggie said, her voice as pleasant and unrevealing as she could make it. "Could we go over the order? Cal has a list?" Cal, who had lived in this county for 11 years, and had the instinct of a man who had survived many social situations through strategic silence, produced the list immediately. She managed the order efficiently, negotiated a small adjustment on the flour price that Cal acknowledged, with a sideways glance that meant he was impressed, and got them out of the store in 22 minutes. In the wagon on the way back, Cal said, "You handle yourself." "I've been doing it a long time," Maggie said. He nodded and didn't say anything else, but she noticed he sat a little less tensely on the drive home. The question came from young Thomas. He was 19 and had the kind of uncomplicated directness that only exists before life has taught you that some questions are dangerous. They were working together in the kitchen garden, she planting, he hauling water, and he said without particular preamble, "Are you going to marry the boss?" Maggie kept planting. "What makes you ask that?" "People in town are asking it." Mrs. Wills told her cousin, and her cousin told Pete's wife when she came by. He set down his water can. "Cal says it ain't anyone's business, but everyone's wondering." "What do you think?" she asked. Thomas thought about it seriously, the way 19-year-olds do when they're trying to have a grown opinion. "I think the ranch is better since you came. The boss seems less tight, like he was wound up real close for a long time and something's loosening." He paused. "I don't know if that's you or just time, but it started when you came." Maggie sat back on her heels. "Thomas," she said, "do you know why I came here? To marry Mr. Reed? My sister was supposed to marry Mr. Reed. She changed her mind. My father sent me instead." She watched his face process this. "I came to tell him the truth and give him the choice to send me home. He didn't send me home, but that doesn't mean the situation is simple." Thomas nodded slowly. "Are you scared?" "Of what?" "Of being here." He gestured vaguely at the ranch, at the mountains beyond it, at all of it. "Being somewhere you weren't picked for." Maggie looked at him. She thought about what she wanted to say. Then she said, "I think the question of whether you were picked for something matters a lot less than what you do once you're there." Thomas thought about this for a long time. "That's real wise," he said. "It's also real practical," she said. "Hand me the trowel." She found Mrs. Henley crying in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. Not dramatically, Mrs. Henley was not a dramatic woman, but sitting at the table with her coffee going cold in front of her, and her eyes suspiciously red, which she immediately tried to conceal when she heard Maggie come in. "Allergies," she said. "Of course," Maggie said, and sat down across from her and said nothing. After a moment, Mrs. Henley said, "I've been here 16 years. "I know. I came when Samuel's parents were still alive. His mother was a good woman. Hard woman, but good. When she died—" She stopped. "I stayed because someone had to, and because I didn't have anywhere else that wanted me." A pause. "I thought when he wrote to that woman for a wife he'd finally—" She stopped again. Maggie waited. "He's a good man," Mrs. Henley said finally. "He doesn't know how to let people care for him. He thinks accepting care means imposing on someone. She looked at Maggie directly. That's why he works himself half to death and never asks for help. Not because he's proud, because he genuinely believes he hasn't earned the right to need anything. Maggie looked at her coffee cup. 7 years alone, she said quietly. 7 years telling himself he had everything he needed. Mrs. Henley wiped her eyes with a matter-of-fact efficiency. And then he gets a letter from a woman who turns out to be the wrong woman, and the wrong woman turns out to have more sense than 5 right ones. She looked at Maggie. Don't you dare take the East train. Maggie almost laughed. You don't have to worry about that. I worry about everything, Mrs. Henley said. It's my primary occupation. It was the end of the 3rd week when Samuel found her at the fence line. She had discovered sections of the east fence that needed repair. Not urgent, but significant. And she'd made a note of it in the ledger and then on an impulse gone out to look at it properly before reporting it. She wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe because she wanted to understand the whole property, not just the books that recorded it. She heard him right up behind her. You found it, he said. The post is rotting at the base. The wire's still good, but it won't hold if the post goes. She looked at it. 3 of them in this section, maybe 4. He swung down from his horse and stood beside her. They stood there for a moment looking at the fence, the way 2 people look at something that needs attention, not with distress, just with the practical consideration of a problem that has a solution and just needs someone to apply it. I'll send Cal and Thomas out Monday, he said. I already put it in the work log for next week, she said. Under the materials column I listed the post count and the approximate cost if you order from Brennan. He looked at her sideways. You logged a fence repair you found this afternoon in next week's work schedule. I was passing the office and the ledger was open. He was quiet for a moment. Maggie, he said. Samuel. Can I ask you something? You can try. He looked at the fence and then at her, and she had the sense that he was choosing his words with more care than usual, which for Samuel Reed was saying something. Why do you do all this? He asked. The ledger, the garden, the reorganization. You didn't come here to be a ranch administrator. No, she agreed. So why? She turned to look at him directly. Because this place deserves to work better than it's working, she said. And because when I care about something, I take care of it. That's who I am. She paused. And because whether or not I'm here in 6 months, the work is worth doing. It doesn't have to lead anywhere to be worth doing. He held her gaze. Do you want to be here in 6 months? He asked. The question was quiet and direct, and more serious than anything he'd said to her before, and Maggie knew that he was asking something beyond the practical asking whether she wanted to stay, whether this was real for her, whether the woman who had arrived at that station with the truth in her mouth and nothing to lose still meant what she'd implied. Yes, she said, simply, without qualification. Yes, I want to be here. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. But when they walked back toward the ranch, he walked beside her instead of ahead of her, and the distance between them was something smaller than it had been before. It was Cal who told her about Eleanor. Not on purpose. He told her the way a person lets something slip when they've been working beside someone long enough that the boundary between what's relevant and what's private gets quietly blurry. They were in the barn, going over the horse inventory for the ledger, and Cal was talking about a mare that had come to the ranch 3 years back, as part of a trade with a neighbor called Hadley, and he said, Samuel handled that transaction himself. Usually he sends me, but he and Hadley go back from before Eleanor, so... And then he stopped. Eleanor, Maggie said. Cal was quiet for a moment, with the expression of a man who has just said the one word he hadn't meant to say. His wife, he said. Before. Maggie went still. I didn't know he'd been married, she said. 5 years ago, Cal said. Eleanor Marsh, from Denver. Beautiful woman, gentle. She genuinely tried, but frontier ranch life wasn't what she'd thought it would be. She lasted 2 years. He was quiet. She went back to Denver. Divorce was finalized 4 years ago. A long pause. She wasn't the right fit, and she knew it, and he knew it, but it took them 2 years to know it, and it cost him something. He looked at Maggie. He don't talk about her. I shouldn't have said anything. I'm glad you did, Maggie said. Cal looked at her sideways. Why? Because now I understand something I didn't understand before. She turned back to the horse inventory. What's the breeding record on the bay gelding? Cal blinked at the change of subject. Then he told her. And Maggie wrote it down and said nothing more about Eleanor. But inside, she was understanding something that rearranged every interaction she'd had with Samuel Reed over the past 3 weeks. He didn't believe in himself as someone a woman would want to stay for. He'd built himself into someone capable and reliable and sufficient, because capability and reliability and sufficiency were the only currencies he trusted. Feelings could leave. Intentions could change. Beautiful letters could be written by someone who had no intention of honoring them. But work was real. The fence either held or it didn't. The ledger either added up or it didn't. He had built his whole life around things that could be verified. And then Maggie had arrived and started speaking the same language. She found him that evening, sitting on the porch in the last light, the way she'd started to notice he did sometimes when the day wound down, not restless, just present with the end of it. She brought 2 cups of coffee and set one beside him without asking, and sat down in the other chair. They sat quietly for a while. Cal told me about Eleanor, she said. She felt him go still. I'm not asking about her, Maggie said. I'm telling you I know, so you don't have to carry the wondering about whether I know. She wrapped her hands around her cup. I just want to say one thing about it, and then I'll let it be. A pause. Go ahead. She wasn't wrong to leave, Maggie said. And you weren't wrong to want her to stay. Some things just aren't the right fit, and the only dishonesty would be pretending otherwise. She looked out at the last of the light. But I think it made you believe that wanting someone to stay is the same as asking too much, and it isn't. The silence that followed was very long. You've been here 3 weeks, Samuel said finally. I know. You can't know things about me in 3 weeks. I know, she said again. But I know what I've seen. She turned to look at him. And what I've seen is a man who built something remarkable, and then decided he didn't have the right to want anyone to share it. He looked at her for a long time in the dying light. What do you want, Maggie? He asked. Truly. She thought about it. I want to earn my place here, she said. Not be given it, not be tolerated in it. I want to build it the same way you built this ranch through work and time and honesty. She held his gaze. I'm not in a hurry. I'm not asking you for anything tonight. I'm just telling you that whatever this is, I'm not going anywhere. He looked at her, and then he looked away. But his shoulders had dropped by a degree, that particular release of tension in a body that has been braced for a long time and has just cautiously begun to believe it doesn't have to be. They sat together in the quiet until the light was gone, and neither of them needed to say anything more. But something had been said anyway, something that neither of them could quite take back, and deep in the house behind them. Mrs. Henley, who had been listening through the window she had definitely left open by accident, allowed herself one small private smile and went back to her dishes. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Maggie knew something was wrong before Samuel even opened it, because Cal brought it in from the mail run with the particular expression he wore when he was bracing for something, not alarm. Just that quiet pretension of a man who has learned to read trouble before it introduces itself. Samuel took the letter and read it standing at the kitchen counter. He didn't read it twice. He folded it once, set it face down on the counter, and said, I need to ride out to the north pasture. Tell the men I'll be late for dinner. He was gone before Maggie could say anything. She looked at the letter on the counter. She did not read it. But Mrs. Henley, who had been in the kitchen longer than Maggie had been alive, and who had developed over 16 years a near-perfect understanding of the weight of Samuel Reed's silences, came and stood beside her and said quietly, That was postmarked Denver. Maggie looked at her. Eleanor, she asked. Mrs. Henley shook her head slowly. The return address was a law office, she said. Samuel didn't come back until well after dark. Maggie had kept his dinner warm and sent the hands to the bunkhouse, and told Mrs. Henley to go to bed, and then she sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and waited because she had the instinct that tonight was one of those nights when a person needed to come home and find someone there. She heard his boots on the porch. He came inside and stopped when he saw her. "You don't have to wait up," he said. "I know." She got up and put his plate on the table and poured him fresh coffee. "Sit down and eat something." He sat. He ate without tasting it. She could tell the mechanical refueling of a man whose mind was somewhere else entirely. She sat across from him and didn't ask anything and waited for him to find his way to it. He set down his fork after a while. "Victor Hadley is moving against the ranch," he said. She kept her expression even. "The neighbor you traded the mare with. The same." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. "He's filed a challenge to my title on the north and east sections. Claims there's an error in the original land grant from my father's time, a surveying mistake that puts the boundary 200 yards further west than I've always held it." He looked at the table. "That 200 yards takes out a third of my best grazing land, the water source on the east side, and 2 of the line shacks." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "Is there an error?" "I don't know." His jaw tightened. "I've always held the land to the line my father established. I've held it for 20 years. But if Hadley has a lawyer saying the original survey was wrong..." He stopped. "The lawyer is from Denver, a man named Collier. He specializes in land title disputes." "Which means Hadley hired someone who does this for a living," Maggie said. "Which means Hadley has been planning this for a while." Samuel's voice was level, but she heard the current beneath it. The particular anger of a man who has just discovered that something he thought was a known quantity has been calculating against him in the dark. "Victor Hadley has wanted the east water source for 12 years. I've turned down 3 purchase offers. I didn't think he'd..." He stopped again. "You didn't think he'd try a legal route," Maggie said. "I didn't think he had the grounds for one." "Does he?" The silence that followed was the heaviest one she'd sat through since arriving at Reed Ranch. "I don't know," Samuel said. "That's what the letter is about. The lawyers notified me of the challenge. I have 60 days to respond with documentation of my title." "Do you have the original survey documents?" "I have what my father left me, which is a deed, some correspondence, and a ledger from the original grant." He looked up at her. "I haven't looked at any of it in years. It's in the storage room off the office, my father's papers." "Then that's where we start," Maggie said. He looked at her. "We," he said. "You built this ranch," she said simply. "I'm not going to sit in the kitchen and make biscuits while someone tries to take 200 yards of it." She pushed back her chair and stood up. "Show me the storage room." The storage room held 20 years of a dead man's careful life. Joseph Reed had been, it turned out, a thorough man, the kind who kept everything labeled, most of it, and organized it with the systematic patience of someone who understood that paper was how the law remembered things. There were document boxes stacked in order by year, correspondence files, tied in bundles with different colors of ribbon, and at the back, a locked tin box that Samuel opened with a key he'd been carrying on his watch chain for 12 years without needing it. Inside the tin box was the original land grant, and 3 letters from the Territorial Surveyor's office dated 1862 that made Maggie's breath catch when she read them. "Samuel," she said. He looked up from the box of deed correspondence he'd been sorting. "The surveyor wrote to your father 3 times in 1862, she said carefully. "The first letter confirms the original boundary survey. The second, she read it again to make sure she had it right. The second notifies your father of a correction to the eastern boundary markers following a review of the initial measurements." She looked up. "He moved the boundary markers 40 yards east of the original line." "That's in my favor," Samuel said. "Yes." She held up the 3rd letter. "But the 3rd letter is a dispute from Victor Hadley's father. He's contesting the correction. He claims the review was done improperly and the original line should stand." She set the letter down. "The 3rd letter has no response attached to it." Samuel stared at the letter. "Which means we don't know if my father answered it," he said, "or what the territorial office decided. Which means Hadley's lawyer found the disputed 3rd letter and is building his case on it," Maggie said, "and hoping you don't know the 2nd letter exists." The silence in that room was very different from the one at the kitchen table. This one had the particular quality of something shifting not in a bad direction, but in a direction that was going to require work. Hard work. Fast work. "We need the territorial records," Samuel said. "We need whoever the surveyor's office was reporting to in 1862, Maggie said. "Because if there's a final ruling somewhere in a government archive, that's the document that settles this." She looked at him across the table of his father's papers. "Is there anyone in Denver who might know how to find it?" "There's a land attorney named Foster," Samuel said slowly. "He handled the estate when my parents died. He's old now, but he knows the territorial record system." "Write to him tonight," Maggie said. "Tell him what you've found. Ask him where the resolution records from the 1862 boundary dispute would be filed." She was already restacking the letters in date order. "And Samuel." "What?" "Don't tell anyone else about these letters yet. Not until we know what the territorial records say." She looked at him steadily. "If Hadley's lawyer finds out you have the second letter, he'll start building around it before you have the full picture." Samuel looked at her across his father's papers in the small hours of a Tuesday night. "You think like a strategist," he said. "I think like a woman who kept a failing farm running for 8 years, she said. Which turns out to be the same thing. The town found out about the land challenge within a week. Maggie didn't know how. She suspected Mrs. Wills at the general store, who seemed to operate as a sort of informal information exchange for the county, but she couldn't prove it, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that on her next supply run into Calder, the atmosphere had changed. It wasn't hostile. It was something more complicated, the particular social climate of a small community watching a situation develop and not yet having decided which way to lean. People were pleasant to her face, but she noticed that the conversation stopped a beat too quickly when she came through a door, and the questions people asked were slightly too casual, and Mrs. Wills looked at her with an expression that was almost sympathetic, except that it had too much curiosity in it to be purely sympathetic. She was tying the supply wagon outside the general store when a woman she hadn't met before came out of the milliner's shop across the road and looked at her with the direct assessing gaze of someone who has come to look and has decided not to disguise it. The woman was perhaps 45, well dressed in the practical way of someone who has money and doesn't feel the need to announce it. She had gray beginning at her temples and the kind of composed bearing that came from knowing exactly who she was. "You're the Collins girl," the woman said. Not unkindly, but not gently either. "From Reed Ranch." "I am," Maggie said. "Maggie Collins." "Ruth Hadley," the woman said. "Victor's wife." Maggie kept her hands busy with the supply list. "Mrs. Hadley," she said, "I want you to know," Ruth Hadley said, "that what my husband is doing is not my idea, and it is not something I support." She said it the way someone says something they've been carrying for a while and have decided they need to put down. "Victor has wanted that water source for a long time, and he's convinced himself it belongs to him, and he's not going to listen to anyone who tells him different. Not me, not his sons, not reason." She looked at Maggie directly. "I'm telling you this because you seem like a practical woman, and I want you to understand that the man you're dealing with has made up his mind, and his lawyer is very good, and being right doesn't always win." Maggie looked at her. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Samuel Reed is a decent man," Ruth Hadley said. "He's done nothing to deserve this." A pause. "But my husband isn't cruel. He's just decided something, and when Victor decides something—" She stopped. "Just be careful. Collier is thorough." She walked back across the road and into the milliner's shop. Maggie stood by the wagon for a moment with the supply list in her hand. Then she climbed up and drove back to the ranch, and her mind was running fast all the way home. Charlotte arrived on a Thursday. Maggie did not know she was coming until the wagon appeared on the ranch road in the early afternoon. Not the supply wagon, not any ranch vehicle, but a hired rig from the Calder station that pulled up to the front of the main house while Maggie was in the office, cross-referencing the territorial correspondence. She heard voices. Mrs. Henley's. A man's the wagon driver. And then a voice she recognized from the whole of her life. A voice like warm honey and early spring. A voice that had always known exactly how to fill a room. Maggie set down her pen. She walked to the office doorway. Charlotte Collins stood in the main hallway of Reed Ranch in a traveling dress the color of storm clouds and a hat with a ribbon, looking exactly as she always looked. Effortlessly. Lovely. Slightly breathless, with the particular expression she wore when she had made a decision and was prepared to be forgiven for it. She saw Maggie, and her face did something complicated. "Maggie," she said. "Charlotte." Maggie kept her voice completely level. "What are you doing here?" "I came to—" Charlotte stopped. She looked around the hallway, taking in the house with the quick assessment of a woman cataloging a situation. "I needed to see you." "You could have written." "I needed to see you," Charlotte said again, and this time it came with more weight. Is there somewhere we can talk?" Maggie showed her to the kitchen because it was where she was most comfortable, and because she had learned in the past weeks that comfort was a tactical advantage. She poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and sat down. Charlotte sat across from her and wrapped her elegant hands around the cup and looked at Maggie with the expression she wore when she was working up to something. "How is Daniel?" Maggie asked. Charlotte's jaw tightened slightly. "Fine." "Is he with you?" "No." A pause. "He's in Millfield." "I see." Silence. "Maggie." Charlotte said, "I made a mistake." "About Daniel." "About all of it." Her voice dropped. He's not the life I thought." She stopped and pressed her lips together and looked at the coffee cup. "I thought I wanted town life and comfort and someone civilized, and Daniel is those things. He's very civilized." The word came out with a flatness that said everything. "He's civilized and he's dull and he doesn't see me. Not really." She looked up. "Samuel's letters were different. He was different. And I know I gave that up. I know it was my own fault. But I thought if I could just—" "Charlotte." Maggie's voice was quiet and hard and precise. "What did you come here to do?" Charlotte looked at her. "I came to see Samuel," she said. Maggie set down her coffee cup very carefully. "You're married to Daniel Pryor," she said. "I know that. You cannot come to this ranch and—" "I just want to talk to him." Charlotte's voice jumped in pitch slightly. "I just want to tell him I don't know what I want to tell him. I want him to know that I regret it. That the letters were real even if I wasn't brave enough to—" She stopped. "The letters weren't real," Maggie said. Charlotte stared at her. "They were beautifully written," Maggie said, keeping her voice even. "You always wrote beautifully, but Samuel read them as the truth of who you were, and they were the truth of who you wanted to be when you were sitting at a writing desk in comfort, imagining a different life." She held her sister's gaze. "He came here and built a real thing, with real work and real hardship and real loneliness. And you decided that wasn't the life you wanted, which is your right. But you don't get to come back now because your comfortable life is less exciting than you imagined, and tell him you regret it." Charlotte's eyes had filled. "You're in love with him," Charlotte said. Maggie said nothing. "Maggie." Charlotte's voice had gone very quiet. "Are you?" "What I am or am not," Maggie said carefully, "has nothing to do with why you cannot be here right now. You cannot be here because you are married to another man, and because this ranch is in the middle of a serious legal challenge, and because the last thing Samuel needs right now is—" "What legal challenge?" Charlotte asked sharply. Maggie stopped. "What's happening?" Charlotte leaned forward. "Maggie, tell me." Maggie looked at her sister, her beautiful, complicated, impossible sister, and made a decision. "Victor Hadley is challenging the title on Samuel's eastern land," she said. "He has a lawyer from Denver. He's claiming a boundary survey error. We have 60 days to respond with documentation." She watched Charlotte's face. "Why, what do you know about Victor Hadley?" Charlotte was very still. "Daniel's brother works for Collier," she said. "The law firm." Maggie stared at her. "Thomas Pryor works for Collier and Associates in Denver," Charlotte said slowly, as if she was thinking it through as she said it. "He was in MILF 2 months ago for a visit. He and Daniel had a long conversation about land claims in the Colorado Territory. I wasn't meant to hear it. She looked at Maggie. I didn't think anything of it at the time. What did they say? Daniel's brother said Hadley was a reliable client, that there was a case in development that had some complexity to it, that the key was making sure the other party didn't know what evidence existed until it was too late to respond properly. Charlotte's voice had gone flat and focused. He said 60 days wasn't enough time for a working rancher to pull together territorial records unless he had help. The kitchen was very quiet. They planned the timing, Maggie said. I think so. 60 days, filed at the start of the busy season. Maggie's mind was running fast. So Samuel would be splitting his attention between the ranch work that has to happen and the legal response that also has to happen. She stood up. Charlotte, did Thomas Pryor ever mention a specific piece of evidence? Anything about a surveyor's letter? A correction? He said. Charlotte thought hard. He said the case turned on a disputed letter. That there was a letter that supported Hadley's claim, and the original owner had never responded to it. The third letter, Maggie said. What? We found it. In your father's? She stopped. In Samuel's father's papers. We found all 3 letters, including the second one, the one that corrects the boundary in Samuel's favor. She looked at Charlotte. Collier knows about the disputed third letter, but he may not know about the second. Charlotte stared at her. Maggie, she said, if Collier knows you have the second letter, he'll change his strategy, I know. Maggie was already moving toward the door. I need to find Samuel. Maggie. Charlotte caught her arm. I'm sorry. Maggie stopped. She looked at her sister's hand on her arm. She looked at her sister's face, which was doing all the things Charlotte's face did when she was genuinely sorry. The slight quiver of the chin, the brightness in the eyes that wasn't performance. I know, Maggie said. I know you are. She put her hand briefly over Charlotte's. Stay here. Don't talk to anyone. Don't tell anyone why you came. She met Charlotte's eyes. And Charlotte, don't talk to Samuel tonight. Give me tonight to handle this. Charlotte nodded. Maggie walked out. She found Samuel in the north pasture and told him everything in 6 minutes on horseback. He listened without interrupting, which was how he always listened, completely with his full attention, and without the impatient, anticipatory expressions of people who are listening mostly to find where they can speak next. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Charlotte's at the ranch, he said. Yes. Another pause. And her brother-in-law works for Collier. Yes. And she came here because... It doesn't matter right now why she came, Maggie said, and kept her voice steady. What matters is that she gave us information Collier doesn't know we have. He thinks we don't know about the coordination with Daniel Pryor. He thinks the timing is working against us. She looked at Samuel. We can use that. Samuel looked at her. How? We stop waiting for Foster's letter, she said. We ride to Denver ourselves, next week. We go to the Territorial Records Office directly, and we pull every document from the 1862 boundary dispute, and we find out what the final ruling was. She held his gaze. If the ruling favored your father, and it's in the record, this case ends. Collier can't argue against a finalized ruling. And if it isn't there, if there was no final ruling, then we find out now, she said, while we still have time to respond. Not on day 59. He looked out at the pasture. You'd come to Denver, he said. Unless you don't want me to. He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was one she hadn't seen before. Not the quiet efficiency of a working day. Not the careful restraint of an evening conversation, but something more unguarded than either. Something that looked like what it actually was. Gratitude, and something deeper than gratitude. I want you to, he said. She nodded. Then we leave Monday. She turned her horse. Maggie, he said. She looked back. Charlotte. I know, she said. We'll deal with that when we get back. She looked at him steadily. Whatever she came here to say to you, I need you to know that I am not afraid of it. I want you to hear me say that clearly. He held her gaze. I hear you, he said. She rode back toward the ranch. Charlotte was in the kitchen with Mrs. Henley when Maggie came in, which meant that Mrs. Henley had already formed an opinion about Charlotte, which meant Maggie would know soon enough what it was, because Mrs. Henley's opinions did not remain internal for long. The opinion turned out to be charitable with reservations. "She's not what I expected," Mrs. Henley told Maggie privately in the hallway. "She's got more sense than she lets on." "She's always had sense," Maggie said. "She just applies it selectively." Mrs. Henley looked toward the kitchen. She asked good questions about the ranch, about the work. She wanted to know what the days are actually like. A pause. She looked sad. "She is sad," Maggie said. "She made a choice she can't unmake, and she came here hoping—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter. She's leaving tomorrow." "Does she know that?" "She will." Samuel came in from the pasture an hour later. Charlotte was sitting in the front room when he walked in, and he stopped when he saw her with the particular stillness of someone encountering something they had been told to expect, but were not quite prepared for. Maggie was in the hallway. She did not go in. She listened. "Charlotte," Samuel said. His voice was even. "Samuel." Charlotte stood. "I know I shouldn't have come." "Then why did you—" A pause. "Because I needed you to know I was sorry." "All right," he said. And there was something in the way he said it, not cold, not warm, but settled. The voice of someone who has already placed something in the past and is looking at it from a necessary distance. "I accept the apology." Charlotte made a small sound. "That's all." "What did you want, Charlotte?" he asked, not unkindly. "Really?" A long silence. "I don't know," she admitted quietly, honestly, in a way that was more Charlotte than most of what Charlotte usually showed. "I thought I wanted you to be angry, or hurt, or I thought if you were still, if there was still—" She stopped. "But you're not, are you?" "No," he said gently. "I'm not." Another silence. "She's good for you," Charlotte said. "Maggie, she's better for you than I would have been." "I know that," Samuel said. "I think I knew it inside of a week." Maggie, standing in the hallway, pressed her back against the wall and closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. "Then I'll go," Charlotte said. "Tomorrow morning. I'll have Cal arrange the wagon." Footsteps. The front room door opened, and Charlotte came into the hallway and found Maggie there, and they looked at each other for a long moment. "You heard," Charlotte said. "I heard." Charlotte nodded slowly. "You were always the better one. I just never had the grace to say so while it mattered." She walked down the hallway toward the guest room, and Maggie stood very still in the quiet of the house and let the words find their way in. Let them go past the places where she'd been told she was suited for hard work and rough living. Past the years of being the practical one, the invisible one, the one who stayed when something needed doing, and felt them land somewhere she hadn't known was still waiting to hear them. Then Samuel was in the hallway. He looked at her. "She's right," he said quietly. "For what it's worth, she's right." Maggie looked up at him. "We leave Monday for Denver," she said. Her voice was a little unsteady, but only a little. "We have a land title to defend." He looked at her for a moment longer. "Yes," he said. "We do." He went to his office to write the letter to Foster, and Maggie went to the kitchen and sat down with her notebook and began making a list of every document they needed to pull, every record they needed to find, every thread of evidence that would stand between Samuel Reed and the man who had been planning in the dark to take what he'd built. Outside the window, the night had gone completely black and cold, the way frontier nights did, sudden and total and without apology. But inside, every lamp was burning. They left for Denver on Monday morning before sunrise. Cal had the wagon ready at 4:30 without being asked twice, which was Cal's way of saying he understood the stakes. Mrs. Henley had packed food for the road more than they needed because Mrs. Henley expressed worry through provisions. Young Thomas held the horses and said nothing, but he watched them go with the expression of someone who has decided the outcome of something matters to him personally. Samuel drove. Maggie sat beside him with the document case on her lap. The tin box, the 3 surveyors' letters, the original deed, and everything else they'd pulled from Joseph Reed's storage room over the past 4 days, organized and indexed in the order she expected to need them. They didn't speak much in the first hour. The road was dark and cold, and the horses found their rhythm, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't need filling, because both people in it are thinking hard about the same thing. Foster wrote back, Samuel said eventually. I know. I read the letter before I gave it to you. She said it without apology. He confirmed the 1862 dispute went to arbitration. He believes the ruling documents are in the Territorial Land Office on Larimer Street. He wasn't certain if they'd been transferred to the new filing system. If they haven't been transferred, then they're in the original archive boxes in the basement, Maggie said. Foster mentioned a clerk named Aldridge, who's been there since before Colorado was a state. He says if anyone knows where the old documents are, it's him. Samuel glanced at her. You already have a plan. I had a plan on the second day, she said. I've been refining it. He looked back at the road. What happens if the ruling isn't there? He asked. If it was lost or never filed properly. Maggie had thought about this. She'd thought about it at 2 in the morning for 3 nights running. Then we present the second letter as the last documented official action on the boundary, she said. The correction letter moves the line 40 yards east of where Hadley is claiming. Without a superseding ruling, the correction stands as the operative document. She paused. It's not as clean as a final ruling. Collier will argue the dispute was never resolved. But it's better than nothing, and it establishes that the government itself moved the line in our direction. Samuel was quiet for a moment. In our direction, he said. She realized what she'd said. She didn't correct it. Neither did he. Denver was 3 days' travel. They stopped at way stations overnight. Separate rooms. No conversation that needed to be had about it. Just the practical management of the journey. Maggie used the evening hours to go through the documents again, building and rebuilding the argument in her mind, testing it against everything Collier might throw at it. On the second evening, at a small station, where the dinner was mediocre and the coffee was worse, Samuel sat across from her at the table and watched her work. You've done this before, he said. Not the legal part. The working a problem like this. When the farm was failing, she said without looking up from the documents, I spent 2 years trying to find ways to make the numbers work. Talking to the bank, talking to the county assessor, finding arguments for why the debt terms should be restructured. She turned a page. I saved it for 3 years past, when it should have gone under. What happened after 3 years? Charlotte married Daniel Pryor, and my father decided the farm wasn't worth the effort anymore. She said it without bitterness, just as fact. He sold it to a neighbor for half what it was worth and moved into town. Samuel was quiet. You saved that farm, he said. For a while. And he sold it anyway. Yes. And then he sent you west to replace your sister at a stranger's ranch. Yes. She looked up. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you asked why I work problems the way I do. The answer is that nobody was coming to do it for me. So I learned. He held her gaze across the table. Maggie, he said. Samuel. When this is over, he stopped, started again. When we get back to the ranch. One thing at a time, she said gently. Let's win this first. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and picked up the copy of the second surveyor's letter and read it again, and she went back to her notes, and the evening went on around them with its ordinary sounds. But something had been started and not finished, and they both knew it, and the unfinished thing sat between them like a held breath for the rest of the journey. The Territorial Land Office on Larimer Street was exactly what Maggie had expected from Foster's description, a serious building run by serious men who believed in the weight of documentation and had organized their lives accordingly. The clerk at the front desk was not Aldridge. He was a younger man named Patterson, who had the defensive efficiency of someone who has learned to manage a high volume of requests by never committing to anything. Records from 1862 would be in the archive, Patterson said, if they've been transferred to the new system. If they haven't, I can't tell you where they are. "We'd like to speak with Mr. Aldridge," Maggie said. Patterson looked at her with the expression of a man who is wondering why a woman is doing the talking. "Mr. Aldridge is the senior archivist," he said. "He doesn't handle public inquiries directly. Could you tell him that Joseph Reed's son is here about the 1862 Hadley-Reed boundary arbitration?" Maggie said. "And that it's time-sensitive." Patterson looked at Samuel. Samuel looked back at him with the particular expression of a man who has been patient but has a finite supply of it. Patterson went to find Aldridge. Aldridge was 70 years old, small, and moved through the archive room with the proprietary ease of a man in his natural habitat. He shook Samuel's hand and looked at Maggie with frank curiosity and said, "You're not his wife." "Not yet," Samuel said, and Maggie kept her expression completely neutral. Aldridge turned toward the archive stacks. "The Hadley-Reed dispute. I remember it. Your father was a stubborn man." "You knew him?" Samuel asked. "I processed his correspondence. I know everyone who's ever filed anything in this office in the way that you know people through their paperwork." Aldridge moved efficiently between shelves. Joseph Reed filed a formal response to the Hadley challenge within 30 days of receiving it. Most people didn't bother. He did. He pulled a box from the shelf, checked the label, put it back, pulled another. He also hired a surveyor of his own to do a second measurement. The second measurement agreed with the correction letter. Your father's line was correct. "Is that documented?" Maggie asked. "It was arbitrated," Aldridge said. "The Territorial Arbitration Board reviewed both surveys in the fall of 1862 and issued a ruling." He found the box he wanted and set it on the work table. "It should be in here." He opened the box. He went through the contents with the practiced speed of a man who had organized these files himself and knew exactly what order they were in. He stopped. He went through the contents again more slowly. He looked up. "It's not here," he said. The silence in that room was absolute. "What do you mean it's not there?" Samuel said. "The arbitration ruling should be in this box. The correspondence is here, both surveys, the board's receipt of the materials, the scheduling of the arbitration." Aldridge was frowning, genuinely troubled. "But the ruling itself is not in this box." "Could it have been misfiled?" Maggie asked. "Possibly. It also could have been—" He stopped. "Mr. Aldridge," Maggie said carefully, "has anyone else requested this file recently?" Aldridge looked at her. He looked at Samuel. He went to the request ledger on the desk by the door and ran his finger down the page. 3 months ago," he said, "a lawyer named Collier requested access to the 1862 Hadley-Reed correspondence file." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. "Did he remove anything?" Samuel's voice was very quiet and very controlled. "He wouldn't have been permitted to remove documents," Aldridge said. "But I wasn't present that day. Patterson handled the access request." He closed the ledger. Patterson would have been in the room with him. Samuel looked at Maggie. Maggie was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "is there a copy of the arbitration ruling anywhere else? A secondary record, something that would have been sent to a different office as a matter of standard procedure," Aldridge thought. He thought the way people think who have spent 50 years in archives, not quickly, but thoroughly running through systems and procedures and cross-references with the methodical patience of a card catalog. "The arbitration board sent rulings to 3 places," he said slowly. "This office, the county assessor where the land was located, and—" he paused, "the territorial governor's office. For any ruling involving a land boundary dispute over a certain acreage, a copy went to the governor's office for their records." "Which governor's office in 1862?" Maggie said. "Territorial governor. The office was in Golden then." He looked at her. "It's been reorganized twice since then. The records from that period were transferred to the state archives when Colorado achieved statehood in '76. "Where are the state archives?" 2 blocks from here," Aldridge said, "on Arapahoe Street." Maggie turned to Samuel. Samuel was already reaching for his hat. They found the ruling in 40 minutes. It was filed under the governor's correspondence from October 1862 in a box labeled Land Boundary, Territorial Arbitration, and it was exactly what they needed. 3 pages in a clerk's careful hand, signed by 2 members of the arbitration board, and the territorial governor's representative ruling unambiguously in favor of Joseph Reed's corrected boundary line, and dismissing the Hadley challenge as unsupported by independent survey evidence. Maggie read it twice. Then she handed it to Samuel. She watched him read it. She watched the thing in his face that happened when he reached the final paragraph. The ruling's conclusion, which stated in the clear language of official documents that the corrected boundary as established by the government surveyor in June 1862 was confirmed as the legal and binding boundary of the Reed land grant, and that no future challenge on the basis of the original survey would be entertained by the territorial government. He set the document down. He sat back in his chair. "That's it," he said, quietly, like a man who has been holding a very heavy thing for a long time and has just been told he can put it down. "That's it," Maggie said. He looked at her. "We need certified copies," she said. 3. 1 for the court, 1 for our records, 1 for Foster to hold. She was already standing. "Aldridge said there's a certification process that takes about 2 hours. We should start it now." "Maggie." His voice stopped her. She turned. Howe was looking at her with the unguarded expression she'd seen twice before, once at the fence line, once in the hallway after Charlotte left. The expression that lived below the careful competence, below the quiet efficiency, below everything he'd built to function without needing anything. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Collier still has to stand down, and Hadley has to be told that the ruling exists and has been found, and that his lawyer has been working from an incomplete file." She paused. "We need to decide how to handle that." "We handle it together," Samuel said. "Yes," she said. "We do." She went to find the certification clerk. They were back at the land office on Larimer Street 2 hours later, with the certified copies, and Aldridge was waiting for them, with Patterson standing beside him, looking considerably less comfortable than he had that morning. "I spoke with Patterson about the Collier visit," Aldridge said. There was a weight in his voice. "Patterson says Collier asked to photograph the contents of the file. Patterson allowed it." "Photographing isn't removing," Samuel said. "No. But—" Aldridge glanced at Patterson. "Patterson also says Collier asked a great many questions about whether there were secondary copies of the arbitration ruling. Patterson told him he didn't believe any existed." The silence was brief and sharp. "Patterson told him no copies existed," Maggie said. "Yes." "And you're certain that was an error in Patterson's knowledge, not—" "I am not making an accusation," Aldridge said carefully. "I'm telling you what was said." Maggie looked at Patterson. Patterson's face had gone a particular shade that said everything she needed to know about whether it was an error in knowledge or something else. She didn't press it. They had what they needed. Pressing Patterson served nothing and risked turning an ally into an obstacle. "Thank you, Mr. Aldridge," she said. "Your help has been essential." Aldridge nodded. "If Collier tries to argue the ruling is invalid because it's from the governor's archive rather than the land office," he said, "I'll testify that the governor's copies are equally authoritative. Both offices received the same document." "We may take you up on that," Maggie said. They found Collier's office by asking at the courthouse. Samuel had wanted to send a letter. Maggie had said no. A letter gave Collier time to prepare, time to construct a counter-narrative, time to consult with Hadley about next steps. A direct visit gave him none of those things. The office was on the second floor of a building near the courthouse, the kind of well-appointed space that communicated success quietly and deliberately. A secretary showed them in, after Samuel gave his name, and Collier came out of his inner office with the smooth confidence of a man who had controlled most of the conversations in his professional life. He was perhaps 50, well-built, with a lawyer's practiced neutrality of expression and very alert eyes. He looked at Maggie, and then at Samuel, and then back at Maggie, with an assessment that was too practiced to be obvious, but not practiced enough to be invisible. "Mr. Reed," he said, "I didn't expect a personal visit." "I expect there's quite a lot about this visit you didn't expect," Samuel said. He set the certified copy of the 1862 arbitration ruling on Collier's desk. Collier looked at it. He picked it up. He read it. He set it down. His expression had not changed in any way that a casual observer would have noticed. But Maggie was watching his hands, and his hands had gone very still, in the particular way that hands go still when a person is working hard at not showing a reaction. "Where did you find this?" Collier said. "The State Archive," Maggie said. "The governor's copy, which has been there since October 1862, untouched in a box labeled clearly enough that it took us 40 minutes to locate it." A very small pause. "I was unaware of the governor's copy." "I believe that's accurate," Maggie said. "I also believe you were aware that the land office copy appeared to be missing, and that you made inquiries through a clerk named Patterson about whether secondary copies existed, and that you filed your challenge in part on the assumption that the ruling would be difficult to locate." She kept her voice entirely pleasant. "I'm not making a legal accusation. I'm describing what the evidence suggests." Collier looked at her with the expression of a man who has just substantially revised his assessment of who he's dealing with. "You have 3 certified copies," he said. "Yes. And you're prepared to file them with the court in response to the challenge." "Before the end of the week," Samuel said. Collier was quiet for a moment. He looked at the ruling again. He was doing what lawyers do when they are determining whether there is any remaining argument, running through the possibilities with the professional detachment of someone who separates the task from the outcome. Then he set the document down. "I'll need to advise my client," he said. "Of course," Samuel said. "Advise him that the ruling is unambiguous. Advise him that the boundary my father established is the legally confirmed boundary. And advise him that if he wishes to discuss purchasing the water access he's been wanting for 12 years, I'm prepared to have that conversation at a fair price once the challenge is formally withdrawn." Collier looked at him. "You'd sell him access?" Maggie asked. She hadn't known this. She heard it the same moment Collier did. "A limited access agreement," Samuel said, looking at her. "For his southern herd during the dry months. A fair rate, proper terms, my lawyer reviews it. He gets what he actually needs. I get the legal trouble off my land and a decent neighborly arrangement." He looked back at Collier. "Tell him that's the offer. Tell him it has a time limit. And tell him that if he'd asked for it 12 years ago instead of going to law, he'd have had it a decade sooner." Collier studied him. "I'll deliver the message," he said. They shook hands and left. On the street outside, Maggie walked beside Samuel for half a block before she said anything. "A limited access agreement," she said. "He's going to be my neighbor for the rest of my life," Samuel said. "Ruth Hadley told you he's not cruel, just stubborn and decided." He glanced at her. "Winning this completely and making him a permanent enemy serves nothing. Giving him something reasonable and ending it serves everyone." She thought about this. "Ruth Hadley told you what she said to me. You told me the night you got back from the supply run." He looked at her. "I remember everything you tell me, Maggie." She kept walking. "The access agreement was good thinking," she said. "I had time on the drive to Denver," he said. "While you were organizing the documents." "You were strategizing." "You were organizing. I was strategizing. Between the two of us, we covered the ground." She looked at him sideways. He was looking ahead at the street. "Between the two of us," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "Just that." They walked on. They stayed one more night in Denver before the return journey. Separate rooms again, same boarding house. But at dinner, something had shifted in the atmosphere between them, the particular shift that happens when two people have been through something together and come out the other side, and the territory they're in now is different from the territory they started in. They talked about things that weren't the land challenge. Samuel told her about the ranch in his father's time. The early years, the hard winters that took half the cattle, the slow building of something from almost nothing. He talked about his father the way people talk about complicated men when enough time has passed to see them clearly, with love and frustration, and the particular respect you develop for someone who built things that outlasted them. Maggie told him about her mother. She hadn't talked about her mother in a long time. Her mother had died when Maggie was 16, and the farm had changed after that, grown more functional and less human, because her mother had been the one who made it feel like something beyond a place to work. She told him about the recipe tin she'd brought from home, and why. She told him about her mother's hands, which had been rough like hers, and which her father had always held at the end of the day, every day for 20 years. "That's what I wanted," she said quietly. "Growing up. Not the security or the land or any of it. Just someone who holds your hand at the end of the day. Someone who chose to." Samuel was looking at her across the table. "My mother used to say," he said slowly, "that a man who doesn't know how to be chosen doesn't know how to be loved." She meant my father. He spent the first 10 years of their marriage waiting for her to leave because he couldn't believe she'd stayed. A pause. I thought I understood what she meant, but I didn't, not really, until... He stopped. "Until Eleanor left," Maggie said gently. "Until Eleanor left," he agreed. "And I thought, well, that settles it. That's the answer. This is a life that asks too much of people." "And then your letter got answered by the wrong Collins sister," Maggie said. A beat. "And then Samuel Reed did something she had not seen him do once in the 7 weeks she'd known him." He smiled. Not the almost smile, not the slight softening at the corners. A real smile, unhurried and unguarded, the smile of a man who has just found something funny and is not trying to conceal it. "The wrong Collins sister," he repeated. "I told you on day one I wasn't the one you wrote to," she said. And she was smiling too, she couldn't help it. "You did," he said. "You stood on that platform and told me the whole truth before I could ask a single question." It seemed like the right approach. It was the right approach. He looked at her. "It was also, for the record, the most terrifying thing anyone has ever done to me." Terrifying. A woman I'd never met told me the truth I didn't expect and offered me a choice I didn't want to make, and then looked at me like she'd keep standing there until I answered. He shook his head slowly. "Do you know how long it had been since anyone offered me a real choice about anything?" She looked at him across the table. "No," she said quietly. "Tell me." "Too long," he said. "Long enough that I almost didn't know what to do with it." "What did you do with it?" "I carried your bag," he said. "Because I didn't know how to say that the woman standing on my platform, telling me the uncomfortable truth, was already more real to me than 6 months of letters." The dining room of the boarding house was quiet around them. Maggie set down her coffee cup. "Samuel," she said. "Maggie, are you going to keep making me wait for this conversation?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "I don't think I am." He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. Not with ceremony. Not with any particular drama. Just the simple, deliberate placement of a hand over another hand, the way her father had done for her mother every evening for 20 years. The thing she'd wanted and described and thought she was describing to the air. His hand was warm and rough and certain. She turned her hand over under his. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I told you that the night you found me at the fence line. I'm telling you again now in Denver with the papers in the bag, with Collier backing down with everything, I'm not going anywhere." "I know," he said. "Do you believe it?" A pause that wasn't a hesitation, but was a man making sure he answered truly. "I'm getting there," he said. "You've given me good reason." "I'll keep giving you good reason," she said. "That's easy. That's just being myself." "That's all I'm asking," he said. Outside the boarding house window, Denver went about its evening business. Inside, 2 people sat at a table with their hands joined and said the things that needed saying. Not everything, not yet, but enough. Enough to know the shape of what was coming. Enough to be sure they were both going toward it. And the next morning, when they loaded the wagon for the return journey home, Samuel put his hand briefly on the small of her back as she climbed up, just for a moment there and gone, and Maggie sat straight and looked at the road ahead and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost stopped believing it existed. Chosen. Not as a replacement. Not as the practical option. Not as the woman suited for hard living. Just chosen. By a man who meant it. They turned the wagon toward home. They came home on a Friday afternoon. Cal was at the gate when the wagon rolled in, which meant he had been watching the road, which meant the whole ranch had been watching the road, which was the kind of thing nobody would admit and everybody had done. He took one look at their faces and said, "We won." "We won," Samuel said. Cal nodded once the way. Cal nodded when something important had been settled short. Definitive no theater. Then he took the horses without another word and led them toward the barn, and Maggie heard him say something to young Thomas that made Thomas let out a whoop that carried clear across the yard. Mrs. Henley was on the porch. She looked at Maggie. Maggie nodded. Mrs. Henley pressed her lips together in that tight, controlled way she had when she was feeling something she had decided not to express dramatically, and then she turned and went inside, and by the time Maggie came through the door, the kitchen already smelled like the good beef stew and the dried apple dessert that Maggie had learned meant Mrs. Henley was celebrating. Samuel set the document case on the office desk and stood there for a moment with his hand on it, not doing anything, just standing. Maggie came to the doorway. "You should sleep," she said. "We've been on the road for 3 days." "I know." He didn't move immediately. "Maggie." "Samuel." He turned from the desk and looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his most honest one, the one without the efficiency or the management, just the man underneath all of it. "I want to say something, and I want to say it now before the work starts again and the days take over," he said, "before it gets crowded out." She stayed in the doorway. "All right," she said. "I've been thinking about what you said at dinner in Denver," he said. "About your mother, about what you wanted." He looked at her directly. "I want to give you that. Not because you earned it by saving the ranch, or because you're the practical option, or because Charlotte left. Because you're who you are, and you've shown me who that is every single day since you stepped off that train and told me the truth before I could ask a question." The hallway was very quiet. "I'm not a man who speaks easily," he said. "You know that." "I do," she said. "So I want you to understand that when I say this, I mean it completely." He took a breath. "I love you, Maggie, and I'm asking you to marry me. Not to fulfill an arrangement, not because it's practical, because I cannot imagine this ranch or any day I have left without you in it." She had known this was coming. She had known it since Denver, since his hand over hers at the table, since the morning he touched her back as she climbed into the wagon. She had known it the way you know the weather is changing, not from one sign, but from the accumulation of everything. And still, when he said it, it hit her somewhere so deep and so old that her eyes filled before she could manage them. She didn't try to manage them. "Yes," she said. "Samuel, yes. That's the only answer I have." He crossed the hallway in 3 steps and took her face in both his hands and kissed her with the careful, certain tenderness of a man who has waited a long time to be sure and is now completely sure, and Maggie held on to the front of his shirt and felt 7 weeks of restrained hoping come loose all at once. From somewhere in the kitchen, there was the sound of Mrs. Henley vigorously stirring something that did not need that much stirring. The formal withdrawal of the Hadley challenge arrived by post 10 days later. Collier's letter was precise and impersonal, as legal letters are. The challenge was withdrawn on the basis of newly discovered documentation, confirming the 1862 arbitration ruling in favor of the Reed boundary. There was no admission of anything. There was no apology. But folded inside Collier's letter on plain paper without a letterhead was a separate note in a different hand. Samuel read it and passed it to Maggie without a word. It was from Victor Hadley. It said, "I am told by my wife that I owe you an apology, and she is correct as usual. I also understand you have proposed a water access arrangement. I would like to discuss it. My wife suggests you bring your woman. Ruth would like to meet her properly." Maggie read it twice. "Your woman," she said. "He's not a subtle man," Samuel said. "No." She folded the letter. "We should go. To Hadley's ranch. Ruth Hadley came to me on a street corner in Calder and warned me about her own husband," Maggie said. "The least I can do is have a proper conversation with her." She looked at Samuel. "And the water access arrangement should be settled face to face. It'll hold better if both men have shaken hands over it." Samuel looked at her. "When did you get so wise about men?" he asked. "I've been watching Cal and Pete argue about that cattle drive for 2 months," she said. "I've learned a great deal." They rode to the Hadley Ranch on a Tuesday. Victor Hadley was exactly what Maggie had expected from Ruth's description. A large, direct man in his 60s, with the bearing of someone who had gotten his way most of his life, and had developed as a result the particular stubbornness of a person who had never been required to be flexible. He shook Samuel's hand with the frank grip of a man concluding one chapter and starting another. And he looked at Maggie with the assessing squint of someone who hadn't expected to be impressed and was working out how to recalibrate. "You're the one who found the ruling," he said. "We both did," Maggie said. "Collier said it was you." He said it without apparent resentment, which surprised her. "Said you walked into his office and laid it on his desk and explained the situation to him like he was a slow student." A pause. "He didn't say it admiringly. I did." Ruth Hadley came out of the house and took Maggie's arm and walked her inside for coffee with the firm warmth of a woman who has made a decision about someone and is acting on it. And behind them Maggie heard Victor Hadley say to Samuel, "Your woman has a good head," and Samuel say, "She does. She also has a name," and Victor say, "What is it?" and Samuel say, "Maggie, and she'll be Mrs. Reed inside the month." There was a pause. Then Victor said, "Congratulations." And he sounded, Maggie thought, like he meant it. Inside the Hadley kitchen. Ruth poured coffee and sat across from Maggie and said, "Tell me how you found it." So Maggie told her. All of it. The document box, the 3 letters. Aldridge, the State Archive. Patterson's uncomfortable face. Ruth listened with the focused attention of a woman who appreciated a well-executed plan, and at the end she said, "Collier told Victor the ruling couldn't be found." "The ruling was in the State Archive 2 blocks from Collier's office," Maggie said. Ruth looked at her coffee cup. Victor trusted him. "Victor wanted to win," Maggie said, "which made him trust the person telling him he could." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "You're not wrong." She looked up. "Is Samuel going to pursue anything against Collier for the Patterson situation?" "No," Maggie said. "Patterson may have been careless, or he may have been worse than careless. Either way, pressing it doesn't serve anyone. The ruling exists, the challenge is dropped, and the water access arrangement gives Victor something real." She looked at Ruth directly. Sometimes the best outcome isn't punishment. It's a situation everyone can live with. Ruth studied her. "You're very practical," she said. "I've been told," Maggie said. "I mean it as a compliment." Ruth smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that lived in the eyes. "Victor needs a neighbor he can respect. I think he's found one, both of them." The water access agreement was signed at the Hadley kitchen table that same afternoon with Ruth and Maggie as witnesses, and afterward, Victor Hadley opened a bottle he'd been keeping for a significant occasion and poured 4 glasses and said with the blunt sincerity of a man who had decided to be done with one version of himself, "I should have asked you for this 12 years ago." "Yes," Samuel said. "You should have. I was—" Victor stopped. "I was convinced the land was mine by right, that the original survey was right and the correction was a mistake." He looked at his glass. "Turns out I was wrong. The arbitration board agreed with my father's survey in 1862, Samuel said. Your father had the same argument you did. It didn't hold then either." A pause. "No," Victor said. "It didn't." He raised his glass. "To settling old arguments. To settling them honestly," Samuel said. They drank, and Maggie sat at that table and understood something she hadn't put into words before, that the world was not changed by dramatic confrontations or triumphant moments alone, but also by small rooms and plain tables and 2 stubborn men deciding to stop. The wedding was set for the 3rd Saturday in September. This produced in Mrs. Henley a state of organized intensity that the ranch hands privately described as alarming and publicly described as impressive. She had opinions about everything: the menu, the flowers, the arrangement of the tables, the order of events, and she expressed them all with the confidence of someone who had been waiting 16 years for an occasion worthy of her full capabilities. Cal's contribution was to say, "Don't make it fussy," and then stand back and let Mrs. Henley do whatever she was going to do, which was the wisest management decision he'd made in 11 years. Young Thomas asked Maggie with the earnest directness of 19 years if she needed anyone to walk her in. "I don't have family coming," she said. She had written to her father. He had written back a brief letter that said he was glad it had worked out and that he wished her well. She had read it twice and set it aside and felt not grief exactly, but the particular quiet of a door closing on something that had never quite been open. Charlotte had written separately. Charlotte's letter was 2 pages, real pages, the kind that Charlotte wrote when she wasn't performing. She said she was working on her marriage. She said Daniel was not as dull as she'd decided he was, that she'd been unfair to him in ways she was only beginning to understand. She said she hoped Maggie was happy. She said she knew Maggie was happy because she'd seen the ranch and she'd seen Samuel's face, and she'd been paying attention even when she seemed not to be. At the end she wrote, "You were always the better one of us. I just needed you to be gone before I could see it clearly. I love you, Maggie. Be happy in the way I didn't know how to be." Maggie had sat with that letter for a long time. Then she'd written back and said, "I love you too. Come visit when you're ready. The ranch has a good guest room, and Mrs. Henley makes excellent biscuits. Samuel would like to meet you properly, the version of you that's real, not the version from the photograph. I think he'd like her." So when Thomas asked if she needed someone to walk her in, she looked at him for a moment and thought about her mother's hands and her father's brief letter and Charlotte's 2 real pages and said, "Would you like to?" Thomas stood up straighter. "Yes, ma'am, I'd be honored." "Then it's settled," she said. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and cold and impossibly bright in the way of Colorado autumn mornings that seemed to have been arranged deliberately. Maggie dressed in the small room that had been hers since the night she arrived, the room she'd stood in after dinner that first evening, and told herself there was a train east in the morning. The dress was simple cream-colored. Charlotte would have worn, and exactly right. Mrs. Henley had pressed it and declared it suitable, which was Mrs. Henley's version of calling it beautiful. She stood at the small mirror and looked at herself. She thought about the train platform, the ticket that had her sister's ghost on it, the man at the end of the platform, turning his hat in his hands, looking for someone who wasn't coming, and then looking at her. She thought about the kitchen at 5 in the morning, the biscuits nearly burning the cup of coffee she'd pushed across the table the moment he sat down and said one thing at a time. She thought about the fence line and the ledger, and Mrs. Henley's opinions, and Cal's gruff approval, and Thomas's questions, and the long ride to Denver with the document case on her lap, and the archive box, and the 3 pages in a clerk's careful hand that had settled a wrong that had been waiting 20 years to be righted. She thought about his hand over hers at the dinner table. She thought about the hallway outside the office, and what he'd said, and what she'd said, and how it had felt to say yes. Not because she had to, not because it was practical, not because she was suited for hard living, but because she wanted to. She was ready. The ceremony was held outside because the day demanded it. The ranch hands stood in a row in their best clothes, which in Thomas's case was a new shirt he'd bought in Calder specifically for the occasion, and which he wore with the self-conscious pride of someone not yet used to dressing up. Cal stood at the end of the row with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the suspiciously bright eyes of a man who had decided this was not an emotional occasion and was losing the argument. Mrs. Henley stood slightly apart from everyone, correctly positioned to be useful if anything was needed, and occasionally pressed her hand briefly to her mouth and looked at the sky in the way she did when she was not going to cry. The minister from Calder was a steady, plain-spoken man named Reverend Marsh, who had married many frontier couples, and understood that what was required was clarity and brevity, and the kind of language that meant something. Thomas walked Maggie across the yard with his arm held out like a man twice his age, and his face set in the solemnity of someone taking a responsibility seriously. Samuel watched her come. He had the expression she knew best, the quiet, present, entirely focused expression of a man giving his full attention to the most important thing in his current field of vision. but underneath it, barely managed, was something she'd only seen fully twice before. The unguarded thing. The real thing. She reached him, and Thomas released her arm with a small nod that she returned. "You're here," Samuel said quietly. Just to her. "I told you," she said. "I keep telling you. I'm not going anywhere." The corner of his mouth moved. "I believe you," he said. Finally and completely. Reverend Marsh opened his book. They said what needed to be said. Not the elaborate performances of city weddings, the long-rehearsed vows, the theater of it. They used the simple words, the ones that had been used for centuries, because they contained everything necessary and nothing extra. "Do you take this woman?" "I do." "Do you take this man?" "I do. With everything in me. For everything this life brings. In the hard seasons and the easy ones, in the winters that take too much and the summers that give it back, in the work that never ends and the evenings that do. I do." When Reverend Marsh pronounced them, Married Cal's careful composure lasted exactly 3 seconds before he cleared his throat very loudly and looked at the horizon, and Thomas let out the same whoop he'd let out the day they came back from Denver, and Mrs. Henley stopped pretending she wasn't crying and simply stopped pretending. Samuel held Maggie's face in his hands, the way he had in the hallway, and kissed her with the same careful certainty, and she heard the men behind them, and Mrs. Henley, and the sound of the ranch around all of it, the horses in the barn, the wind, the open land, and felt it all settle into place around her, like something that had been waiting for her to arrive. After dinner, after the celebration had wound down, and the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, still talking after Mrs. Henley had declared the evening a complete success, and retired with the satisfaction of a general who has won a well-planned campaign. Maggie and Samuel sat on the porch in the dark. The same porch, the same chairs, the same quiet, but everything different. He reached over and took her hand. Just that. The simple, certain placing of his hand over hers. The thing she'd described over a dinner table in Denver. The thing her mother had had, the thing she'd wanted without quite believing she'd find. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while without speaking, listening to the ranch settle into the night around them. "I want to ask you something," Samuel said eventually. "Ask. Do you remember what you said to me the morning you decided to stay, when I found you at the stove at 5 o'clock, and you told me you wanted to stay as yourself, not as Charlotte's replacement?" "I remember. You said whether or not you were here in 6 months, the work was worth doing." He paused. "I've thought about that a lot. The fact that you were prepared to give everything you had to this place without knowing if you'd be allowed to keep it." She thought about it honestly. "It was the only way I knew how to be," she said. "I couldn't hold back and wait to see if I was wanted before I decided to care. That's not how I work. I know that about you now." "I hope so," she said, "because it's not going to change." He was quiet for a moment. "Maggie," he said. "Samuel, I need to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." His voice was low and careful in the way it was when he was saying something real. "When you stood on that platform and told me the truth, my first thought wasn't what to do about Charlotte, or about the arrangement, or about any of it." He looked out at the dark. "My first thought was, this woman is the most honest person I have ever seen in my life. And then my second thought was, how do I make sure she doesn't leave?" She looked at him. "You could have said something," she said. "I didn't know how." He turned to look at her. "I'd spent 7 years building a life I could manage alone, because alone was the version I'd proven I could survive. I didn't know how to want something I wasn't sure I deserved." "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "I know I deserve you. Not because I've earned you, or because the ranch is in order, or because we won the land challenge. Because you showed me that being chosen isn't the same as being tolerated. And I'm choosing you, Maggie. Every day from this one forward, I'm choosing you." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Do you know what my father told me when he gave me that ticket? That you were suited for this life." "Yes, he meant it as a practical statement. He meant I was strong enough for hard work and not delicate enough to need anything soft." She looked at his hand holding hers. For a long time I believed that was all I was. The practical one. The useful one. The one who does the work no one else wants. She paused. You didn't see me that way. You never did. You saw the work, but you also saw the person doing it. And that is the thing, Samuel. That is the whole thing. He squeezed her hand. You were never a replacement, he said. I need you to know that I know that. Not just now, not as a wedding night sentiment. I have known it since the morning you nearly burned the biscuits and sat down across from me and said you wanted to stay as yourself. I knew it then. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. Because I was afraid, he said, plainly without excuse. I was afraid you'd come to your senses and take the East train. I was afraid that if I let myself want it too visibly, I'd push it away. So I just... He stopped. I just let you stay. And I watched. And every day I watched, I understood it better. Understood what? That you weren't filling Charlotte's place, he said. You were building your own. Something entirely new that didn't exist before you came. The ranch is different because you're in it. Not better organized, not better supplied, different. Alive in a way it wasn't. He looked at her steadily. You are not the woman I wrote to. You are the woman I would write to if I were writing today. You are the woman I would write to every day for the rest of my life. The night held them in its quiet. Maggie thought about 6 months ago. The kitchen table, the ticket. Her father's flat voice telling her she was suited for this. She thought about 4 days on a train moving toward an unknown. She thought about standing on that platform with her 2 bags and her mother's recipe tin and her one promise to herself. Tell the truth, stand straight, accept what comes. She had told the truth. She had stood straight. And what had come was this. This man. This ranch. This hand over hers in the dark. This life that no one had planned for her, that she had walked into with nothing but honesty, and built with nothing but herself day by day and decision by decision until it was more hers than anything she'd ever been given. I used to think, she said quietly, that being chosen meant someone looked at everything you were and decided you were enough, that it was a verdict, a judgment passed. She looked at him. But that's not what this is it? No, he said. It's not a verdict, she said. It's a decision you make again, every morning, every hard day, every evening on this porch. Every morning, he agreed. Every hard day. And you're going to keep making it, she asked. Not from doubt, from the need to hear it. Maggie. He turned to face her fully. I have not been a man who makes promises lightly. You know that about me. I know that about you. Then hear this one. He held her gaze with the complete steadiness of a man who has found the ground under his feet and is standing on it fully. I will choose you every day. Not because you saved the ranch. Not because you outthought a Denver lawyer. Not because you made this house feel like a home for the first time in 11 years. Because you are Maggie Collins, Maggie Reed now, and there is no version of any day I want to live that doesn't have you in it. She held that. She let it go all the way, in past the places her father's words had built their walls, past the years of useful and practical and suited for hard things. Past every morning she'd gotten up and done the work, without knowing if it was ever going to amount to anything more than the work. She let it land where it was meant to land, and she said, then we're going to be all right. Yes, Samuel Reed said. His voice was certain, the way the mountains were certain. Not loud, not insisting on itself, just completely and durably there. We are. The ranch went on around them in the dark, breathing its ordinary night sounds. The horses, the wind, the vast and patient land that had been here before either of them, and would be here long after, and was theirs now to tend. And Maggie Collins, who had arrived on a train with someone else's ticket, and 2 bags, and a promise to herself, who had stood on a platform and told the truth before anyone could ask for it, who had built a life out of honesty and work and the refusal to be invisible. Maggie Collins held her husband's hand in the dark and understood finally and completely what her long journey had been for. She had not been sent west as a replacement.